primary. Okay. Voilà. Less attention was instead given to cultural and literary issues, which are nevertheless of primary importance for understanding the history of Archytas' dove. As a matter of fact, only one text informs us about the dove, that is the Attic Nights, book 10 and paragraph 12, by the Roman author Aulus Gellius, moreover through a citational enunciative mode, that is a quotation of Favorinus of Arles, the famous rhetorician of the 2nd century AD. So our presentation aims to provide a more in-depth investigation of Archytas' dove, starting from a pragmatic perspective in which particular attention is paid to the context. First of all, the context of Favorinus' quotation in Gellius' paragraphs. Then the context of this paragraph in the miscellaneous work conceived by the Latin author, and the latter's relationship with ancient paradoxography and with other traditions of knowledge, literary or not, from zoology to mechanics. An attempt will be made to investigate the different cultural and ideological representation around the important questions of the agency of inanimate objects, animals, and divine intervention, in order to better understand the network of text and meaning within which the isolated mention of Archytas' dove is placed. I don't, okay. Can you see the screen? Okay. Yeah. So I'd like to start from this brilliant article published in the Smithsonian Magazine and entirely devoted to the history of one of the wonders of robotics, particularly mechanical birds. It is an article which deals with, from the Archytas dove just till the mechanical birds conceived by Leonardo da Vinci. And it is in a way a typical example of the interest of many modern readers in the famous Archytas dove. Placed in an artificial chronological line of time, halfway way between the very distant past of the Greek myth and its craftsmen, Hephaestus, Daedalus, or the wicked Delphinus, and on the other hand, the first real theorists and writers of technical treatises such as Ctesibius of Alexandria or Philon of Byzantium, Archytas' story takes on the function, narrative first of all, of giving a point of origin, of explaining the remote causes, which in Greek are confused in the term aithia with the temporal origins. On the figure of Archytas of Tarentum, philosopher, politician, and follower of the Pythagorean school at Tarentum at the end of the 5th century BC, much has been written. A complete and in-depth synthesis can be found in the vast introduction to the edition of the testimonies and fragments edited by Karl Uffmann in 2005 for the Cambridge University Press. The sources that make it possible to reconstruct the main features of his figure are of a different nature, from some allusions and direct references in the Aristotelian corpus. Aristotle would also have dedicated a treatise to the discussion of Plato's philosophical thought in relation to that of Archytas, to the later testimonies that we find in authors of the imperial age, from Vitruvius to Gellius to Diogenes Laertius. Diogenes Laertius himself speaks of a treatise on mechanics, which he attributes to a fifth Pemptos Archytas, therefore not the Archytas of Tarentum, of which he also speaks in his list. In this regard, it is very interesting to look at Vitruvius' famous treatise on architecture, where the mention of Archytas of Tarentum is repeated 3 times, while when discussing a treatise, especially on mechanics, De Machinationibus, Vitruvius does not seem to refer to Archytas of Tarentum, but simply to Archytas tout court. It is difficult to determine how much this may indicate Vitruvius' intention to distinguish 2 different Archytas by attributing a treatise on machines, on mechanics, only to the second one. You can find some sources in the slides. I will be a bit quick. But here we have the Ur text, the original text, which is every time cited. And this is the particular part of paragraph 12 of the Attic Nights. You can read also the English translation. Archytas made a wooden model of a dove with such such a mechanical ingenuity and art that it flew. So nicely balanced was it, you see, with weights and moved by a current of air enclosed and hidden within it. This is the translation, as all the translation are taken from the Loeb collections. Many attempts have been made to explain the mechanics of this living and flying dove designed by Archytas. And many researchers thus focused on how the dove could fly. The reconstructions certainly remain hypothetical, and most scholars, starting from Wilhelm Schmidt's hypothesis at the beginning of the last century, agree that the dove essentially was a pneumatic mechanism which would have taken flight, perhaps by spreading its wings, we don't know it, thanks to the compressed air that would have been inside the artifact, and that once freed by a valve, would have allowed it to fly. Much discussed was the reference to the Latin term libramentum, which has been variously interpreted as the dove's aerodynamic equilibrium or balance, or, and this is a more plausible hypothesis, as a reference to a counterweight and a stroke system capable of operating once the valve of the dove is open, in such a way as to allow a relapse of the artifact after the short period of flight. But I will not dwell on these details for two main reasons, because my technical engineering skills are almost completely absent, and above all because the subject has already been discussed and much more proficiently, I think, during the first meeting of this seminar. My goal then will be much simpler, much easier, perhaps banal, but no less complicated. The return to the context of enunciation, the only one in our possession, in which the dove of Archytas is described, namely the work by Aulus Gellius. We will not give answers on whether and how Archytas' dove really walked, but we will try to understand according to which objectives and pursuing which logic Aulus Gellius talked about it. Bringing the Archytas dove back to its context, let's say in passing, will perhaps lead us to better evaluate also some details of its functioning, allowing us to say, for example, that the wooden dove never flew up to a height of 200 meters, at least not according to Gellius and Favorinus, his master and source of authority. The passage extracted from the Attic Nights and normally read every time we discuss the famous Archytas dove is in fact part of a wider context that is worth considering, because it is precisely from the contextual information and eventual linguistic clues contained in it that it will perhaps be possible to grasp aspects that have so far not been adequately taken into account. The story of the wooden dove takes the form of a narrative expansion, a sort of introductory paraphrase to the true heart of the anecdote, which is the quote in Greek attributed to the authority of Gellius, Maître Pensée, Favorinus of Arles. But before this, it is important to remember that Favorinus' quotation and the brief description of the Archytas dove close a paragraph, the 12th of the book 10, entitled just like this, what you see on the slide, De portentis fabularum, quae Plinius secundus, indignissima in Democritum philosophum confert, et ibidem de simulacro volucri columbae. So the translation, this is also the translation by Loeb, of extravagant tales which Plinius Secundus most unjustly ascribes to the philosopher Democritus, and also about the flying image of a dove. By considering this translation, it is perhaps possible to understand why the anecdote of the automaton built by Archytas was considered separate, as if it were something different from the portenta which Gellius talks about in the paragraph titled The Caput. The logical nexus et ibidem does not indicate a simple temporal sequence. This is my opinion, but starting from a local semantic value, it implies a derivation or an implication of Archytas' history from and in the same typology of portenta discussed above. And this is normally, I've just given some example here. This is the loci paralleli when you can find the same kind of structure, and also the Oxford Lady Dictionary, where ibidem, it's not just an addition, it indicates just not an addition of information, but I think that it implies a relation between the two parts of the paragraph. So for this reason, I think that the Archytas dove could be and should be understood in the continuity of what comes before, so as a portentum. So from a linguistic point of view, the textual presentation of this section about portenta follows a discursive structure that brings it very close to the narrative section, to the narrative typology of text. One would not expect this since the paragraph seems centered, I have a bit difficult, okay, seems centered on the presumed groundlessness of some knowledge related to the ancient pharmacopoeia, which are presented as absurd, unproven, and incapable of finding the adhesion of reasonable people. This aspect makes even more serious the lack of honor and respectability in dignitas of people like Pliny, capable of attributing to the authority of respectable philosophers of the past, such as Democritus, some beliefs typical of the ignorant and gullible pharmacopoeia practiced by old witches. Despite this accusatory macro test against a false and deceptive science, in the paragraph there is no trace of rhetorical choices and logical structure of discourse typical of the argumentative text. On the contrary, this passage is very similar to other paragraphs with a narrative structure. One of the salient elements you can see that make it recognizable is the structure as akin to narrative text is that the themes, the assumptions are added to each other in a temporal and non-logical sequence. It's suffice to see what I put in black, item aliud, and you can find that this kind of structure is typical in Aulus Gellius for narrative text. And this is also a sort of list of all terms relating to portenta in this paragraph, relating both to the chameleon episode, which we will analyze, and the Archytas episodes. So as you can see, it is really a textual construction where the attention is on the portentum, on this kind of term. And I just wanted to make you attentive to this essay, because there were a lot of rhetorical studies on Aulus Gellius at the end of the 90s by two great Latinists and linguists in Italy, Alessandro Garcea and Carla Bazzanella, who studied very, very well the rhetorical presentation of material in Gellius, and they made this kind of distinction between argumentative and narrative text. This is just one. Reference. So the core of Gellius' report. Yeah, this is the translation of the passage. The core of Gellius' report concerns Pliny's attribution of magical beliefs and uses of certain animals, and in particular the chameleon, to a respectable philosopher of the past, such as Democritus. The two passages that are harshly criticized by Gellius are presented according to their degree of absurdity from Gellius' point of view. First of all, the magical uses of the chameleon body, its ability to make invisible, its power to attract downward the birds of prey, and to generate a modification of their ethology, which is contained effectively in book 28 of the Natural History by Pliny. And secondly, the possibility that the dead body of a chameleon may give birth to other forms of life, in particular a snake. And this is effectively present in the book 10 of Natural History. So there are two main issues, in my opinion, that are opened by Gellius' text. One, the first, concern directions and procedures of transmission and reworking of scientific knowledge of the past, while the other one concerns more widely the traditions of knowledge and the conflicts between different ways of explaining and appropriating the natural world, to which is linked the important issues of the conditions of their credibility or effectiveness. As for the first point, that is the transmission of scientific knowledge, is it possible to believe that Pliny, as Gellius claims, could really read a work entitled On the Properties and Nature of the Chameleon, De Vi et Natura Chameleontis? If so, did this work really pass as an authentic work of Democritus? Or was it part of miscellaneous collections of disparate materials relating to the ancient pharmacopoeia, which must have circulated in abundance in the 1st century AD? If we actually check the catalog of Democritus writings provided by Diogenes Laertius at the beginning of the 3rd century AD, we can note that there is no mention of the book evoked by Gellius. However, there may be other texts included in the catalog from which some information on the chameleon may have been extracted, summarized, and reworked in the course of transmission of zoological tradition, according to other pragmatic contexts and for different fruition purposes. The best candidates as a text source for subsequent reworkings could certainly be the 3 volumes related to the animal world that the philosopher Democritus would have written, that is the Aetiae Periton Zone on the causes of the animal world. Another hypothesis could concern one of the so-called technical books of Democritus, the text on the faculties of food, Peridiaites, or another one called the medical injunction, Iatrike Gnome. By following another possible path, it would be not far-fetched to identify the mysterious book to which Gellius refers and which would have been used by Pliny the Elder as the Artificial Remedies, or Hieromechta, a work focusing on pharmacopoeia remedies in which magic, zoological knowledge, and medicine played important role. This text passed under the name of Democritus according to Pliny, book 24, paragraph 160, while other texts of the Roman imperial age, such as the Re Rustica, so this treatise on the agriculture by Columella, book 7, paragraph 5, attributed it to Bolus Mendesius, or Bolus of Mendes, one of the most important authors of paradoxographical literature. It is very probable that Gellius has in mind the work of Bolus, or other texts of this kind that he evidently does not consider worthy of being part of the knowledge that a wise person, a peritus, should turn to, because they are considered wrong and deceitful information. What Gellius does not say about Pliny, and this is very interesting, it's that we know that Pliny himself, in its natural history, had considered the magical therapeutic information about the chameleon as unbelievable tales, stories that were the result of the unbridled imagination of the Greeks, that is, Graeca vanitas or Graeca credulitas, which at most could amuse a shrewd Roman reader and intellectual. But Gellius suggests that in his encyclopedia of the natural world, at least I have this opinion, Pliny in some way legitimized these practices, denying their effectiveness, but by reporting them in detail and above all by attributing them to Democritus, he would have made them authoritative. In Gellius' view, the refutation of unfounded information or incredible portenta to which Pliny had somehow given even greater prominence is all the more urgent if we consider the spread of such beliefs, and not only on a popular level. As a matter of fact, parallel to the question of the transmission of knowledge, and we are reaching the second point, it is important to address more widely the cultural context of chameleon-related beliefs. In other words, were there any socially widespread practices regarding the use and properties of the chameleon that could give rise to this debate? And here you have another example, just to give you an idea that this was not just a debate among scholars and the intellectual, but it could have some kind of consequences also on didactic literature, for example, like this example in the Re Rustica, which is not about chameleon, but which cites the Hieromechta, the handwrought products. So despite the impressive work of selecting the text to be read and copied, a cultural phenomenon to which Pliny and Gellius must have contributed in that critical period that was the imperial age between the 1st and 3rd century AD, it would seem that those texts, such as pharmacopoeia recipes taken from plants and animals, still circulated and were widely used. Despite the loss of many of those texts, it is still possible to reconstruct from indirect witnesses some social practices, widespread beliefs, otherwise lost forever. So, for example, in the case of the chameleon in particular, we know very well that the animal was used for the preparation of particular spells that in ancient Greek that in ancient Greek world took the name, among others, of gauging, that is phimotikon, or in plural form, phimotika. And we have testimonies in the Cyranides treatise, we have testimony in this Oxyrhynchus papyrus, which was edited by Franco Maltomini. But above all, I think a very famous episode concerned the vicissitude that happened to the rhetor and public speaker Libanius. We are just at the end of his life, where in the 4th century AD, both in the oration, in the discourse on the spells, so the Periton Pharmakon, and in his autobiography, so this is the text taken from his autobiography, Libanius tells that he had in extremis discovered to have been the object of a magical ritual act that prevented him from speaking. For months and months, the rhetor had nearly completely abandoned all intellectual activity and waited for nothing but death, when one day in the atrium of an auditorium in which he was supposed to perform was found a chameleon dead for some months with his right paw stuck in his mouth. This could explain, according to Libanius' pupils and Libanius himself, the cause of his physical and intellectual distress. A black witchcraft spell of which some of his pupils had already warned him, but which he had not wanted to accept as a plausible explanation of what was happening to him. Are you hearing well? It's okay? Okay. So the criteria that organize knowledge, its verification, the social communicative mechanism that determine the acceptance of the so-called truth have always been very complex and certainly depend on the social groups that organize them. Different social groups over time, but also within the same political community. It is not necessary to recall today the endless controversies that official science, recognized and supported by public and private research institutions, engages every day to disprove fake news, unfounded information about viruses or astronomical knowledge. For this group who spreads such unfounded news today, and who first of all believe in such fake news, Paul Venn, in his wonderful book, would have spoken of a balkanization of brains, because what he called the truth programs change. They change from group to group, and truth becomes a more labile reality, at least for many human groups in the ancient world, but still today. I just put some main points of this wonderful book by Paul Venn, because I think that it is, at least it was my, my key in order to understand the passage of Gellius. And what is very interesting to me, it's just the last point. So the criteria of the reliability of myth are not based on a distinction between truth or falsehood, but determined procedures of knowledge capable of accounting for mythical reality. The instruments of allegorical interpretation, rhetorical and syllogistic reasoning, and finally, the principle of authority are some of the criteria that inform the constitution of ancient knowledge, in which tradition and vulgate are realities that exist regardless of their truth. This is, I think, what is at stake in our passage of Gellius, which concerns not only the chameleon, but also the second part of my speech, dealing with the Archytas dove. Here you have sort of quotation by Paul Venn, but I think that we can go on. So I think that it is coming back to Gellius' paragraph from which we started, it is worth noting that he introduces a fairly strong and clear opposition when he goes on to deal with the dove of Archytas, compared to what was said before about the beliefs related to the magical nature of the chameleon's body. If the spectacular sight of a wooden object moving on its own strikes the sensitivity of the spectators and remains unexplained as something extraordinary, admirabile, on the other hand, the value judgment on the reality of such a phenomenon must not be in doubt. The unfounded nature of the magical practices which concern the chameleon is totally denied for Archytas' dove, neque tamen vanum, this is the expression. used by Gellius. The type of artifact designed and built by Archytas could be catalogued in that kind of self-propelled objects, the automata, whose first systematic traces we have from the Hellenistic age and the very first decades of the imperial period. First of all, in the work of Philo of Byzantium, 3rd century BC, which we read today only in an Arabic translation, and which dedicates an entire book to automata. And then with the most extensive work of Hero of Alexandria in the 1st century AD, who wrote an entire treatise on automata and another treatise in 2 books on pneumatics. As it is widely known, many of the automata designed and conceived by Hero represented particular mechanisms that could be part of the scenic apparatus of sacred places and temples of the ancient world. Let's take the case of one of the most famous automaton described by Hero in one of the first chapters of his book on automata. And you have this kind of information in the translation by Francesco Grillo, who made, I think with Isabel, this thesis, which is very, very useful, and I hope that it will be soon published because it's very well made. And this is the translation of the passage. It is done. A self-propelled temple. Under the portico of a temple is placed the statue of Dionysus with a Tirsus. In front and behind the divine figure are placed 2 altars, which at the height of the external columns of the temple are placed 2 Bacchae. So the machine is pushed for a certain time, for a certain amount of time by humans, and then it continues to move on its own until it stops. Once it stops, the altar in front of Dionysus lights up, and milk will flow from the Tirsus, as well as from a cup held by the god. Wine will be thrown on a panther sculpted at his feet. The Bacchae will be swirled around the temple with a sound of cymbals and other instruments, while the figure of Dionysus turns towards the altar from which a powerful flame gushes out. So this is the kind of information we can find in Hero treatises. I just put the translation of this passage because you can see how much Hero focuses on the hyponoia, so the suspects of believers or people who had to look at the spectacle. What was important to them is not to make the mechanism recognizable, so not to make the tricks recognizable from the audience. So the presence of a double level of knowledge, a disparity of the distribution of technical skills seems quite evident in this passage takes from the 2nd book of the Pneumatics. And you can find also a quotation from a very useful article that I find by Karin Tyberg. And I think that it's worth reading this passage because it's very, very interesting. Hero lists some of the effects he can produce in automatic theaters. For example, lifelike movement and noise, a blazing fire that appears inside the theater, and a figure that appears from nowhere. A main component in the stunning character of these spectacles is that the cause of the spectacle is hidden. Hero hides the mechanism that produces the effects. When a figure appears or disappears, it creates surprise because the viewer cannot see from where it comes or to where it disappears. And in the same way, lifelike movements and sound are produced with no visible mechanism or interference from humans. To exclude the possibility of human intervention, Hero even stipulates a maximum size for the automatic theaters in order that the audience does not suspect hyponoia. This was the ancient Greek term, that there is a person inside the theater pulling the strings. So I think that these kind of reflection are of very importance in this kind of discussion about the Archytas stove, because the presence of a double level of knowledge, so a disparity in the distribution of technical skills, seems quite evident in this passage. In this case, a complex mechanical system is conceived with wheels, groups, and pulleys. And this is another passage from the Pneumatics of Hero. Here you have the ancient translation by Woodcroft, but at the end, the new, let's say, the reference by the critical edition by Schmidt for the Teubner collection. In this case, a complex mechanical system is conceived with wheels, ropes, and pulleys capable of activating the rotation of a bird placed on the top of an altar. The hidden mechanism is explicitly placed in a sacred place, a place of worship, as the text explicitly states. Just as see, for example, look at the expression "hoi estallera isiontes," so people who visit the sacred place. Visitors to the temple are asked to turn the wheel, but at least it seems from the indication in the text, they are not told in which direction. As a matter of fact, the rotation mechanism of the wheel is activated only in one direction, and only in that direction the pulley will cause a weight to fall into the cone full of water, which in turn will activate the wheels and make the bird rotate, allowing air to escape, producing the whistle presented as the bird cry. We do not know how much more about this mechanism, but an important term appears in the text, and you have it in bold in the Greek original. The noun agnisterion, a place or an instrument of purification, which would suggest the direction of rotation could be used as a means to verify the purity of the person who operated the mechanism. What is of primary importance here is precisely such an association between the presence of a hidden mechanism and a holy verification process to which a divine agency was attributed with all likelihood. And just to continue in this series, here you have the list of some paragraphs in the book 2 of the pneumatics. So you can see how much these automata were used in cultic context and in temples. But just to give you another example, can you see the screen, or you are seeing just the bar? No? Okay.
We can see it, Marco.
Okay, thank you so much. So, as you all of you know, one of the most famous cases of crowd manipulation through a mechane, what ancient Greek called mechane, is widely known and consists in the oracular cult instituted by a certain Alexander in Abonoteukos, a town on the southern part of the Black Sea. In the 2nd century AD, in a cultic context already dominated by a particular devotion to Asclepius, Alexander seems to establish the oracle of the snake god Glycon. It will undoubtedly be a success in terms of personal and economic prestige for Alexander and the new priest of the cult. But the manifestations, the epiphaniae of the snake, in which the deity had the habit to presentify itself, were accompanied by a peculiar oracular mechanism in which many wanted to see a cunning mechanical expedient aimed at creating a fraud. We can read this rare literary testimony where some kind of tension in Lucian. You can see that the intellectual side of this discussion is represented. So the periti, the pepaideomenoi, who don't want to believe that the oracular mechanism still had this kind of functioning. And they try to explain that the oracular in the Glycon temple was not true, but there was a mechane, there was a trick. So I think that in the light of this consideration on the relationship between technical realization and access to knowledge, the final verbatim quotation of Favorinus' words in Gellius could serve as an incontrovertible proof, a source of authority that cannot be questioned. It is Favorinus himself, and it is Gellius to say that. It is Favorinus himself who affirmed that Archytas had given life and movement to a wooden object. But perhaps the focal point of the quotation is not so much in the sensational information of a wooden artifact capable of flying, but in what comes next, and which perhaps constitutes the most important contribution of Favorino's works, which Gellius takes care to mention. Once it has flown in the air and fallen back to the ground, once the propulsive thrust of the compressed air has ended, the wooden dove lies down. You can see the original Greek quotation, hopote kathiseien uketi anistato. This implies, at least for what we can reconstruct from Gellius' text, that the main point of Favorino's contribution in the Archytas story might have been the unveiling of the hidden mechanism. Favorinus revealed the pneumatic functioning of a work that up to that moment had enjoyed the rather ambiguous reputation of a pure paradoxon, or just to say it in Latin, a mirabile dictu, which many intellectuals or simply reasonable people were not willing to accept. So I think that in a culture without the possibility of video recordings and characterized by a limited circulation of written text, it was certainly very, very difficult to account for the reality of certain wonderful objects without a plausible and credible technical explanation which could justify why a certain apparently inexplicable movement took place. This was the case, for example, we have a case like this. This was the case of one of the most colossal and famous statues in the ancient world, the famous Colossus of Zeus in the Greek city of Tarentum. The giant bronze statue erected towards the end of the 4th century BC in the same city when Archytas was born and lived is described in this brief passage of Pliny. As you know, probably, there is a lot of discussion still today around these expressions. So we can read perhaps. The remarkable thing in the case of the last is that though it can be moved by the hand, manut ferunt mobilis era ratio liberamenti est, it is so nicely balanced, so it is said, that it is not dislodged from its place by any storms. But the question is, what does it mean, Pliny, with this word, with this kind of formulation, manu ut ferunt mobilis? So I think that the real difference between the Archytas dove and the Lysippus dove is just in the fact that Favorinus had given an explanation. I think that in the work of Favorinus, one might have found the key to a very long mystery, which in many cases would have led a good number of intellectuals to censor themselves and to not repeat or spread anecdotes or unverifiable facts. The magical manipulation of flying objects was certainly, or at least could have been, one of the portenta to which one could not give credit. The solution that then had to come from the technical explanation, Gellius did not limit himself to crediting the existence in the past of the Archytas dove only by quoting an Archytas, as he had done for a different and opposite purpose for the chameleon of Democritus. In this case, Gellius wants to say there is logical and mechanical evidence for the existence of the dove. First of all, the technical reasons for its existence were to be found not in magic, but in pneumatics, in a system of weights and counterweights set in motion by a certain amount of heated or compressed air present in the dove's empty body. All this was condensed in Favorinus' lapidary word, to tell the truth, rather banal for us modern people, but not completely useless for a society where the mechanical tricks of the automata were not known or largely widespread among most people. It is very likely that Favorinus had collected such an explanation in his Apomnemonemata, the Memorabilia, the memorable sayings of the philosopher and intellectuals of the past. The answer probably already existed. Favorinus would have just taken it up and spread it precisely so that Archytas dove would not remain an unbelievable paradoxon. Thank you so much for the attention.
Thank you, Marco.
Thank you so much, Marco.
It was a bit long.
No,
I'm sorry.
We thoroughly enjoyed it, so don't worry about it. Isabel will now give her response, and then we'll open the floor to discussion.
Can I share my screen?
Yeah.
I have to stop my sharing. Yeah. Voila.
Thanks.
Please.
I think I have to have permission to do so.
I have given you the permission.
Okay. Yeah, it's working now. So I've got too many screens open. Hold on a sec.
Don't worry, we can wait.
I always think we need intermission music for this kind of thing.
That's true.
At least that's what I've been telling my students for the last. Yeah, okay, here we go.
Great.
Okay, so thank you so much for that presentation. And I wanted to say, first of all, this is partly with my day job hat on, which is I come from studying Greek comedy mainly, and one of the things that's often forgotten in dealing with fragments is the importance of context. I thought that was a very salient point that came from this presentation. And sometimes we're just going to focus in on the fragment and we forget the context. So I think that's a crucial thing. I'm curious as to why Gellius chose this particular automaton, because it's not famous. As you say, it's the one testimonium about this. And although it might turn up in the Smithsonian magazine, it's not where most histories of technology start in the ancient world. So if we think about Vitruvius, you mentioned Vitruvius. So in his list of mechanical writers in the beginning of book 7, in the preface, he lists a whole bunch, and Archytas is not there. So he starts with Ctesibius famously, and he also puts at the head of that list of writers in book 7, Archimedes. He doesn't talk about Archytas. Why doesn't he talk about Archytas? Probably for the same reason that Gellius talks about Archytas, which is that Archytas is a philosopher, or at least he's being presented here as a philosopher. So, and that's also what links him and Favorinus. So this is or someone who can be presented as a philosopher. He's a Pythagorean, and when we get the reference to him as a mechanikos later on, it's very much, he does lots of other things, and he also does that. It's a secondary consideration. And I think what we've got here is a version of the dispute over who owns mechanics. So if you're a philosopher, you own mechanics. If you're hero of Alexandria, then mechanics is a separate category. It's not owned by philosophy. And here it's useful for Gellius to adopt the mechanics is philosophy, because this means you get access to philosophical knowledge. You get the disciplina and the ratio, and a particular kind of disciplina and ratio, I think. And this seems to fit in with what you were saying about Democritus. You know, is this the sort of thing that you can ascribe to a philosopher? No, this is the sort of thing you can ascribe to a philosopher. Archytas is dove, and that seems to be why he's mentioning it here. And also, it's worth picking up, I think, perhaps some of the ways in which, following on from the suggestion that context is important, this is picking up all sorts of things from the Chameleon narrative, right? So it's got the flying and birds kind of plummeting to the earth. It's picking up that kind of thing, but it's doing it in a mechanical mode. So it seems to me there are a number of connections there that might be picked out from the passage. And there's also a wonderful play on invention, different kinds of inventions being ascribed to people. So that was one point I wanted to make. The next point I wanted to make was arising from the Vane quote. So, or at least in the draft that I had. And I think there are a couple of things, sort of background I wanted to make to start with, which is that, okay, so let's agree that fiction, myth, and so on are kinds of contractual agreements. And let's also agree, well, I'm going to agree, I'm going to claim anyway, that the worlds projected by fiction and myth are propositional. But it's also true that the world of reality, big scare quotes, is also a propositional thing. Umberto Eco refers to it as the world of the Encyclopedia Britannica. These days, you might say it's the world of Wikipedia or of Fox News, depending on which part of the world you come from. And you mentioned fake news. So these are all kinds of agreements. But, and this is where I wanted to go with this, when I've been working on Greek comedy, one of the things I worked on was on, or still am, I suppose, is fictionality. And if you can say that fictionality ultimately is a contract, it's one of the questions is how do you signal that contract? And there are various explanations for this, and some are intrinsic to the material, some are contextual. How do we know something's a comedy? It happens at a comic festival. But there are some occasions where, let's just say there's a strong cue from the internal evidence. And I put a couple on the slide here. The first one, appropriately, is a dove. And this dove is apparently from the play Pétélé of Archytas. And rather like the more famous dung beetle of Aristophanes' piece, this seems to feature a courtesan flying off on a pigeon to various Aphrodite related destinations, and probably encountered Aphrodite there. A dove, a flying dove, capable of carrying a full-blown courtesan, just as a dung beetle, which is the second passage, is not something that's particularly plausible. And then so we have to make a decision about how we're going to interpret this. So we can interpret it fictionally. There are other clues too. There's a crane involved too. And unlike the mechanics or the mechanical treatises, the mechanism is not hidden. And we know it's a festival. There are various cues that this is something to be treated fictionally. But the audience know that this is not true, and yet they engage with it. They make a constructive decision to engage with it, which is how our fiction works. And in the second example, they can even play around with how unbelievable it is. So Trygaeus has come in and done his Bellerophon act on the dung beetle, and the daughter has said, that's a completely implausible mythos that you've just come up with. And then we get on to the dung beetle versus Pegasus riff, which I didn't have time to go further. I didn't have space on this slide. So we've got this contract between the audience and the performance, and the performance is self-consciously a performance, and it's self-consciously showing its mechanism, but the audience accept it nonetheless. And I want to contend that it's the same with our automata. And so this idea that the mechanisms are hidden seems to me to be something of a red herring, at least when we get to the developed automata of the Hellenistic period. So one of the things that Hero makes a very clear point about in his treatise is that automata makers used to be known as thaumaturgoi or thaumatopoi, They make us a thaumater. But actually, automaton making is really important because it shows all kinds of mechanical skill. And both those elements are important, the mechanical skill and the thauma. And part of the thauma is actually that this is being done through mechanical skill. So just as, if you like, the thauma of watching comedy is by seeing these implausible things and knowing that they are being performed as implausible things, so the same thing can happen with automata. Whether it's true of all automata, I don't know. But for the kinds of performances that Hero is suggesting, it seems to me to be the case. And so this would be a different kind of thing from the kind of charlatan person with a tube down his tunic or whatever. Or the stories about mime artists with bladders projecting milk and wine, which, you know, superficially look very similar to the Hero of Alexandria automaton. In that sense, they project milk and wine, but there is a difference. The Hero of Alexandria automaton is self-consciously a made thing. It's a constructed thing. It's a very obviously a device. And here we have the what I did on my holidays moment. There is no way that you can present this, a reconstruction of the automaton minus figures, as anything other than a made thing. And you cannot suggest that the dove of Archytas is anything other than a made thing. It's wood. And there's a limit to how lifelike you can make your wood and your counterweights. And so I want to suggest that the kind of wonder that we've got here is much more analogous to the fictionality of an implausible drama like old comedy than we might think. We admire the skill and we admire the effects that are created, and we could even go, wow. And I should say that having spent 3 years on this, watching this actually move forwards and backwards and going around in a circle was a wow moment. I mean, it really was. And saying, despite, you know, video games and all the rest of it, it was still very impressive. But I knew very well that there were all sorts of mechanisms hidden inside of them. And that seems to me to be the point of automaton making in performance and automata in performance, and rather different to the kind of trickery that is sometimes turning up in narratives. And so when we come to the Gallius passage, the dove doesn't need Favorinus to tell us it's never going to get up again to show that it's a mechanical thing. It's made of wood. It's got counterweights, just like the Hero automaton has all sorts of devices, even though we can't actually see them. I should say, just in passing, that you don't push it. You release a you pull a string and it lets the millet or mustard seeds come out at the top, and and then it sets going. So you pull a string and then you run away. Is how it works. So there's a side note to finish. Anyway, that's kind of where I wanted to go with this. That there's a clear distinction between automata in performance and the kind of charlatanism that was being discussed at the end, and that may also be one of the reasons why you bring it in as a distinction from the more obviously lurid things around the chameleon, because it is very much a made thing, and that's where I will stop.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Marco, would you like to say a couple of things first to in response to the response before we start the discussion?
Yeah, I totally agree with Isabel. I just wanted to ask her what does she think about the nature of the of what Gallius talks about. So I had the impression, but I'm not specialist of this kind of literature, that what Gallius was trying to do is to explain something which was told. So if you arrive and you say, Archytas made a dove fly, a wooden dove fly, and this dates back to 4th century BC, and you are in the 2nd AD, I think that the kind of demonstration you have to make is very, very similar to people who say, if you use a chameleon, you can become invisible. So I think we are talking about tales and not, of course, when we talk about hero, as you said, I'm totally agree with you, because I think that you have mechanism that you are in front of something real, not just words. But what was circulating in 2nd century AD, I don't think that there were a lot of spekimina or this kind of instruments to show the Archytas dove. But I think that the Archytas dove was quite similar to the Lysippus Zeus, which was not more there, and there were tales about it. So what do we do with tales? This was my, but I just asking, what do you think about this?
I don't know. I mean, certainly the more extravagant mechanical clocks, the paragon clocks are very similar to the automatic devices that I described, and the kind of things that get described in the Satyricon, for example. Those aren't obviously everyday items, but then Gellius is not writing for an everyday audience either, so it's not impossible that these kinds of that something like not exactly the dove, but something like that could be imagined as a real thing. It seems to me that you're getting a material thing being opposed to this kind of very the difference between burning a creature and weather events happening is very different. There's a very different order to something that's obviously made of wood and doing stuff. So it seemed to be about that kind of distinction, rather than saying that this needs to be explained too. I think the point is it's only superficial. It only superficially needs to be explained. I think that's one of the things he's saying, that it is amazing. It's a Thalma, but it's not Wanum.
Okay.
Partly because it's material. It's almost like literally, it's physically not Wanum.
Okay.
I think that what's opening here is a very interesting discussion about the meaning of wonder, and I mean, picking up on the last point, the one made by Isabel, and then I'll go to Marco's paper. So Isabel, you're saying that basically, to a great degree, what makes this a thing that can be explained, so we need to seek for wonder not in the realm of the unexplainable, but in the realm of wow, this is fantastic, this is wonderful, is the fact that we're talking about material, handmade objects, right? Whereas in contrast to that, as we move to the natural world, be it with chameleons or other stuff, there is more magic, let's say more space for magic in nature, whereas in the artificial world, I'm thinking now that the two kinds of two at least of the meanings that Aristotle is conceiving of when he's talking about thoma. The one is obviously the one about wonder, in the sense of aporia, the kind of stuff that you wonder because you don't really know what is going on. The other one is the kind of admiration, which you develop when you have understood something, and you can feel this admiration precisely because you have understood it. So to open up the discussion a bit more, I'm wondering whether the same kind of audience can experience, in the same circumstances, both kinds of thaumassin, starting from wonder, moving to admiration, and whether, because in the end, the same word, the Greeks are using the same word for both these kind of experiences. So I'm thinking, whether such a distinction can be made, and I think it can be made, but I'm wondering whether in some cases it's more fluid, also because of the fact that, you know, some of these objects are used in ritual and religious contexts, so things get even more complicated. Same people, some of the people in the same audience might react with wonder, others with admiration. So you know, the boundaries, they're not very they're not easy ones to draw. I can imagine someone seeing this dove or whatever else and saying, okay, this is amazing because this is what happens. And I can imagine someone standing next to him, I don't know, depending on what kind of audience that is, saying that, no, there's something magic going on here. Especially, and now I'm trying to finish the point, especially when this kind of blurring of boundaries seems to be intentional, even in so-called scientific contexts, right? I mean, if you take Galen and his anatomical demonstrations, you get the impression that at some point he wants to manipulate his audience. He explains everything he does in, let's say, scientific terms, but then he's very well aware that the audience is not reacting with admiration, but he's manipulating wonder. So this Thomasan thing, it seems to be, you know, to be a very anarchist concept, which, you know, different people communicate with different meanings. So it's a socialist word. so that's my that's the kind of thought that I've been making. That said, I think that even so, it's perfectly understandable that someone like Favorinus would say that that there is a kind of explaining away irony when he says that, and you know, once it stopped flying, then it couldn't get up again. And there is a more, let's say, rational way of deflating the myth. But I enjoyed both. That was my point. I enjoyed both the talk and the response. But yeah.
And yeah, I just wanted to ask Georgios about how Isabel, what do you think of this kind of parallel between the passage of the Archytas dove and the unexplained mystery of the Lysippus Zeus? Because when I thought about Gellius, I thought in this kind of context. So there is something which was told about Lysippus Zeus in Tarentum at the end of the 4th century BC. And then still today, because there is a lot of people in conflict with interpreting this kind of statue. And nobody gave an explanation of this expression. So this, what does Pliny wanted to tell when he said that the Zeus, the Lysippus Zeus could be moved by a hand, but it was not destroyed by the storms. So,
can I say my first response to this was why hasn't anyone amended that to manus as a nominative? I mean, was it the hand? If the hand was mobile, it would make much more sense.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Because you know, we've got lots of things with you know, moving. I mean, like think of the Nyssa statue that I mean,
in Alexandria.
And it would also make sense of having a column there to protect it. I mean, protecting a whole statue with a single column makes no sense at all.
Yeah,
I mean, it'd have to be an enormous column. But having like one part of it protected by a column makes far more sense. But I haven't looked at the passage in original context, so I didn't really go and get a chance to sort of see whether that was a plausible way of dealing with it or not.
Any questions?
If I'm allowed to say something about the back to the wonder thing, and I think the passage from Cicero Republic, when I think Philus there is talking, and he talks about the Archimedes sphere, and how when this sphere came where he is, he could not, although he has heard so many things about the sphere, he could not admire. He didn't not particularly admire it. But then Gallus started to explain and talk about the sphere and describing the sphere, and then Philos, he was able to see the true miracle of the sphere. I think it's something it's similar to what's happening now in Gallus.
Mm-hmm.
And also in Hero, for example, again, I mean, this wonder, this hyponia and krypton, something is hidden from the audience. But I mean, we have also in his pneumatics many parts, some parts of automata are made out of glass. That means they are, you can see the mechanism, is not hidden. You can see the mechanism and admire the mechanism.
Mind you, it also should be said that there's only a small number of those devices in the pneumatica that are actually described as automatus anyway. I mean, it's only the ones which have a counterweight in them that are described as being automatos.
I think Arno wants to ask a question. Let me unmute. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Yorgos. So it's precisely on the same point you touched and Isabel was speaking about. It's to know if there are different kinds of automata, and I think that so in the I know that paradoxa is a kind of modern word for this category of paradoxa, but in the paradoxa there is only phenomena on natural world, and I think that it's completely separate, natural world and artificial world. So in the artificial world you have tricks, you can be lured, it's something visible, and it's a question of techne. And on the natural side, even in Aristotle, so it's a question of what's going on precisely in this case. So it's peculiar cases that must be explained by general or particular rules, but that are not that doesn't match the usual rules and usual norms. And in this text of Gellius, I think that when he passed from the question of the Pliny stories about Democritus to the dove, it's like, it's as if he said, by the way, there is something even more special and interesting, but it is a contrast. And you can interpret the fact that in the same text, and I don't know if there are many texts where natural marvels and this kind of deceptions, technical deceptions, are linked. But maybe it's one of the very few texts where it is in the narrative process. And in that case, you can take it as the proof that there is an evolution in the conception of marvels, integrating artifacts in the marvels, or, and I would be on this, it would be my opinion, or that it is precisely to make an opposition between both kind of phenomena, natural phenomena, but unreal, and this kind of strange thing which has an explanation. It's not difficult to find the explanation in that case. It's not the mystery of nature. It's just a trick, and you know it. So it's very superficial. And I don't think that in this text of Gellius, you are allowed to consider that there is an evolution from the old kind of Thomasia, where you are only natural and not mixed with artificial one, to another kind of considering marvels are something that could integrate in the category artificial one. I think they are separate until the end, and even in this text.
Can I come back on that?
Absolutely, please do. It's
I think it's that.
So we can continue to discuss the discussion. You know, as much.
I mean, I think it's the question of superficiality is the thing that I mean, because I don't think it is superficial that there is a technical explanation that seems to me to be important, and that or maybe I'm just channeling Hero here, but that it's a different kind of problem for sure, and it's a different kind of knowledge, and the audience may not know precisely what the mechanism is, but they know that there is a mechanism. But that's important. I mean, that shows ingenuity that you can admire and wonder at, and that seems to me to be the point, and that doesn't seem to me to be superficial at all.
So it's no less of a marvel just because it can be explained. It's a different kind of.
It's a different kind of marvel, yeah. I mean, I think, and also given what you were saying earlier about audiences, I mean, yeah, I think it's one of these things about audiences that you know, we generalize about audiences all the time, and of course there are going to be multiple voices and multiple views in an audience, but you know, we're always dealing with, you know, I don't know, I guess a plurality perhaps, or part of a social interaction, and there are assumptions on both sides of that interaction, and I'm sure there are going to be, say for example in comedy, people there who are going to go and laugh at the knob jokes and that's it, but let's just say the majority of the audience are going to interact with it.
Any other questions? Maria,
yes.
you're saying something.
Yes, sorry, it was muted. I was saying, if we don't have any other questions, we should thank Marco for his wonderful talk, and Isabel for her response, and we'll meet in around 2 weeks again to hear Christian Leis talking about disability and technology in the ancient world. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Bye.